Darkness falls on Los Angeles. There are shadows that sweep over a city and never truly leave, no matter how bright the lights or how persistent the sunshine. Los Angeles in the late 1970s, outwardly a land of promise where dreams hovered above the palm-lined boulevards, became, almost overnight, the backdrop for one of America's greatest urban nightmares. In sprawling neighborhoods where movie stars rubbed shoulders with working-class families and drifters, the city's famous hills watched silently as terror crept in with the dusk. October 1977 arrived with the first chilly warnings. Hollywood was bustling, neon lights thrummed against the smog, but a strange worry started to coil through the streets. Somewhere beyond the restaurants and movie sets, in the wild tangle above the city, the hills, the scrub, the secret scenic highways, evil moved with a silent purpose. These hills, once romanticized in film, had become something else entirely, the setting for a chilling new legend. The city's reputation as the City of Angels began to taste bitter on people's tongues. Each day, headlines in the Los Angeles Times grew more frantic, whispering about a danger that slipped between the cracks. The hills, so often a refuge for young dreamers and lovers at sunset, were morphing into a graveyard of hope. There was no music in the wind after dark, only the anxious trill of police radios and the heartbeat of paranoia. Parents started warning their daughters to avoid the canyons after dusk. Waitresses ended their shifts in trembling groups, looking over their shoulders as they hurried to parked cars. Cab drivers hesitated to take fares to the winding roads above Mulholland. Rumors swirled at every corner. A serial killer on the loose, bodies surfacing where wild sage and eucalyptus met the asphalt. The bright promise of West Coast freedom flickered and dimmed. Now nobody felt entirely safe, whether you lived in a gated mansion up in Laurel Canyon or a weathered apartment down in Echo Park. For the police, the terror upended normal rhythms. Detectives who were used to chasing burglars or small-time hustlers now stood silent at the periphery of crime scenes that felt almost cinematic in their horror. Bodies found in tangled brush, evidence seemingly scrubbed away by invisible hands, and fear growing like a fungus no investigation could halt. The once familiar hills now held secrets that would haunt the city's psyche for decades. The darkness, in truth, was not just on the hills, but had begun to seep beneath the very skin of Los Angeles itself. The First Body and the Silent Confession. October 17, 1977, dawned over Los Angeles with the same golden sun and indifferent traffic jams as always, but by nightfall, the city's mood had shifted into uneasy silence. The discovery was abrupt and heartbreaking. A 19-year-old woman, later identified as Yolanda Washington, had been found sprawled on a remote hillside near Ventura Freeway. Her body bore stark evidence of sexual assault, and had been meticulously washed, her clothing and skin scrubbed so thoroughly that seasoned detectives muttered darkly about the perpetrator's knowledge of forensics. It wasn't just the brutality that sent chills through the coroner's office, but the message, wordless yet deafening, that the city's innocence had been broken. The way Yolanda's remains were left spoke of something calculated. No fingerprints, no lingering DNA, nothing to help grieving mothers or exhausted officers make sense of the growing darkness. Rumor spread among the officers that the killer might have even taunted them, erasing every trace with deliberate ease, as if daring them to try and catch him. What little hope for a break in the case clung to a single lead. A witness, the owner of a local record shop, who said he'd last seen Yolanda in the company of two men projecting authority. They wore badges on their hips, barked orders like seasoned cops, and herded the girl into the back of a nondescript, license plateless car, as if conducting a midnight arrest. The reality, as it would soon unravel, was far more sinister than anything a Hollywood scriptwriter could dream up. Detectives combed the hills for clues, their flashlights slicing through chaparral and memory. Old hands in the department said they'd never seen anything quite like it, a murder so brazen, so cold, and so meticulously staged. Autopsy reports only amplified the city's dread, painting a picture of a predator who didn't just kill, but calculated his every move to erase himself from the scene, leaving only a sense of shame and helplessness hanging over the city like fog. Yolanda's murder was more than a crime, it was a turning point. In neighborhoods across Los Angeles, conversations over dinner grew hushed. Mothers watched their daughters more closely, and young women kept to the main roads even in broad daylight. Fear seeped into the normal routines of a city used to living loudly and at night. For detectives, the case file grew heavier. not only with evidence but with unspoken anxieties that another body could turn up at any time, ushering in a wave of horror nobody felt equipped to handle. And as the city trembled, somewhere in the shadows, the killer watched, waiting for his silent confession to be properly understood. The mysterious men with badges. No sooner had the city begun to reel from the horror of discovering its first victim, than ominous details began to emerge, raising the stakes in a way that Hollywood itself could hardly have scripted. Lurking just beyond the city's well-lit arteries, in the gray spaces between law and lawlessness, rumors whispered of men who wore the trappings of authority but trafficked only in terror. The lone witness, an unassuming record store clerk, nervous in the glare of police station lighting, became the reluctant chronicler of these shadows. His story, told in careful fragments, was as chilling as it was surreal. He remembered the night with the clarity that only trauma grants. Two men, both tall with a composure that suggested they knew how to command a scene. Each of them bore what appeared to be police badges clipped to their belts, but their eyes lacked the softness of mercy or the steadiness of true authority. Instead of the blue and gold confidence of real officers, their presence oozed something slick and unearned, like actors in a too-dark drama. They spoke with the clipped efficiency of professionals, their tone brooking no challenge as they approached Yolanda Washington on the dim stretch of sidewalk outside the clerk's store. The clerk, trained by years of LA's unpredictable nights not to interfere, watched as the men displayed their fake credentials and ordered Yolanda into the back seat of a waiting car. A bland, unremarkable vehicle with no license plate under the sickly glow of a flickering street lamp. To passers-by, the scene could have looked like a routine Vice Squad pickup, but for those attuned to the undercurrents of the city, or anyone with half a sense for when something is wrong, a chill would have crept down their spines. For local law enforcement, the witness testimony landed like a lead weight. In a city already plagued by distrust and a swelling population of citizens who lived on the economic and social margins, the ruse cut straight to the heart of public fear. The notion that predators moved among them, cloaked in the authority meant to protect, opened a sinkhole of paranoia. Who could you trust after midnight, if not the man with a badge? Detectives pored over every known sex crimes officer, cross-checking schedules, scrutinizing alibis with a comb finer than any they'd used before. Yet, their efforts met nothing but dead ends. There were no matching vehicle descriptions, no falsified badge numbers in circulation, no indication that any real lawman had stepped out of line on that fateful night. The only evidence, the bruising certainty in the record store owner's voice, was as intangible as smoke, frightening, and impossible to pin down. The incident sharpened the edge of anxiety among vulnerable women, especially those working the city's peripheries, whose livelihood already exposed them to danger. The typical after-dark camaraderie that protected them felt suddenly inadequate. Now, even the appearance of police could mean disaster. Cabbies, bartenders, hotel clerks, all began trading cryptic warnings in coded language about badges that don't shine right, and officers who don't call dispatch. As weeks wore on, the city's pervasive sense of dread only sharpened. Mothers phoned their daughters twice nightly, streetwise teens who once mocked their parents now stuck to main roads. For every false lead, every police radio squawk that led nowhere, the legend of the fake cops grew, a myth blooming in the shadows, seeded by a truth crueler than fiction. For Los Angeles, this new breed of predator, one camouflaged in civic trust, would prove the most terrifying of all. Tragedy repeats on the slopes. There's a peculiar sort of dread that creeps into a city when evil doesn't just visit once, but circles back again and again, as if the streets and hills themselves are stained with a memory they can't shake. In Los Angeles, as the winter of 1977 bled toward the new year, this dreadful repetition became an unbearable feature of life, especially for young women whose faces could have just as easily belonged to the next victim. It started, heartbreakingly, with Judith Miller. She was only 15, a girl wrapped in the confusion of her own runaway world, one foot still lingering in adolescence, the other pushed out by the hard-scrabble reality along the neon-lit Sunset Boulevard. To her friends and to those who crossed her path, Judith was a blend of bravado and vulnerability, a survivor masking fear with street smarts. But for all her caution, the city's lurking predators moved faster than her instincts. Halloween night found her chatting with a man beneath a flickering streetlight. It was, tragically, the last conversation she'd ever have. No longer did these stories feel like urban legends. Bodies kept surfacing, each on a different lonely hillside, marked by the signature cruelty of a faceless monster. The city's rolling terrain, its canyons, brushy embankments, and half-finished developments, became dumping grounds for brutality. Even the sunlight seemed colder along the roads winding past Dodger Stadium, or into the shadows hovering between Glendale and Eagle Rock. Each new headline, each fresh tragedy, tightened the collective pulse of the city, as if neighbors and strangers alike were holding their breath in expectation of the next horror to be revealed by morning joggers or restless dogs sniffing the chaparral. Detectives haunted the hills, picking through clues with a desperation that bordered on obsession. Behind every badge was a man or woman brought to their limits, working autopsies that mirrored the city's own unraveling. As bodies multiplied, the pattern snapped into place. Victims were stripped, beaten, tied, often with the very implements meant for restraint by those in authority. It was as if the murderer was mocking the idea of public safety, shredding any sense of sanctuary. Conversations changed in every Los Angeles household. Parents grew frantic, clutching daughters tighter and warning them never to walk alone after dusk. Waitresses pooled their tips and paid for taxis in groups, glancing suspiciously at headlights that crept too slow past the curb. Rumors flourished that there were two men, sometimes described in dark suits, sometimes in police uniforms, always moving under the cloak of supposed authority. The sense of trust once extended to those with badges shrank, replaced by a cold, calculating paranoia. Even the streets themselves seemed to bear witness, echoing late-night patrols with an ever-present question: when would the next tragedy strike and who would it claim? For every young woman found, there was a neighborhood that crumbled a bit more inside, a community that learned to live with a gnawing anxiety. The hills, once romantic backdrops to city dreams, were now the setting of a relentless recurring nightmare, and Los Angeles, caught in this grim cycle, learned new ways to fear the shadows. 10 corpses, a fearful disturbance, 10 bodies, 10 young women whose dreams were cut short and whose stories would never be finished, their memories left hanging in the uneasy Los Angeles air like a warning. The city's fear became a living thing, growing by the day, constricting like smog that didn't lift with sunrise. The hillside strangler wasn't just the subject of rumors or headlines anymore. He was a persistent, paralyzing presence, altering the pulse of every neighborhood from the neon of Hollywood to the suburbs shaded by eucalyptus trees. As winter melted into spring, the city seemed to hold its breath. Victim after victim was found. In every case, the brutality intensified. The names of the lost now household whispers: Yolanda, Judith, Lauren, Kimberly, and more. Each discovery carried the same horrific signature. The victim was young, sometimes as young as 12, stripped of dignity and hope, posed carelessly or hidden with a cruel sense of ritual. Always on a remote hillside, always where the city's wild edges pressed up against fragile civilization. Cindy Lee Hudspeth's body, the 10th, sealed the city's sense of doom. Found shoved into the trunk of her orange car, left like an abandoned toy at the lip of a cliff, her murder came as a final blow. She was no more anonymous than the others, a college student, a daughter, a waitress. Her face could have belonged to anyone's sister or friend. With her death, it was as if the strangler had issued a twisted victory call, a message that he could steal away anyone, any time, leaving only silence and fear behind. Children who once raced their bicycles until dusk now rushed home well before dark, their mothers glancing nervously down empty streets. Waitresses pooled their tips to pay for shared cabs at shift's end. The very hills that once seemed romantic became a collective nightmare. Lovers no longer went for midnight strolls or parked to watch the twinkling cityscape without the shadow of dread between them. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the killing stopped. The city never felt relief, only a hollow, uncertain quiet. 10 victims was not simply a number but an ache that changed the very identity of Los Angeles. It shaped curfews, altered routes, shattered illusions. Invisible boundaries grew thicker between neighborhoods, and the dream of California freedom now flickered beneath dark reminders that evil could walk among angels and get away with it for far too long. The first clues take shape. By 1979, Los Angeles was a city shadowed by memory. The bruising legacy of the 10 hillside tragedies had settled like a smog nobody could see but everyone felt. A cold weight that hung over conversations and crawled beneath the city's famous golden sunlight. But as the months passed and the violence seemed to vanish, detectives felt less relief than a kind of bitter suspense. Had evil simply gotten smarter or just moved on? Then, news as sharp as winter wind arrived from Bellingham, Washington. It was almost a full year after the last horror in L.A., and the geography could hardly have been more different. Pine forests instead of palm trees, sky heavy with cloud, not haze. But the story was all too familiar. 2 college students had disappeared after accepting a job offer from a security guard. The college town was buzzing with police cars and anxious parents, echoing those anxious LA nights when fear had walked the streets in plain sight. In the heart of the investigation was one Kenneth Bianchi, a seemingly harmless security man with an unassuming smile and a fragile, unreliable past. Bellingham detectives, led by instinct and details only the truly desperate notice, poked through Kenneth's inconsistencies, the disjointed timeline, his odd nervousness, the stories that broke apart when pressed. They started to sense that this wasn't a simple case of workplace violence or abduction, and when a dusty California driver's license turned up among Kenneth's belongings, a thread snapped taut. That connection, barely a glimmer, sent a chill through seasoned detectives who recalled the litany of bodies on Los Angeles hillsides. Communication between police departments was no small feat at the time, not in an era of hardwired phones, loaded file cabinets, and overburdened detectives. But the Bellingham team did what good cops always do. They compared, contrasted, and shared stories in the hope that, together, patterns would emerge from the static. What stood out was a method. The young women were lured, not grabbed. The crime scenes appeared calculated and cleaned, but far from random. The story pulsated with echoes, binding materials, careful staging, the absence of careless evidence, a sort of knowledge that only someone with a taste for control might possess. Bianchi's fingerprints, compared against the old LA files, struck the first true spark. Minute, overlapping whorls and ridges matching partials from the city's most infamous hills. Suddenly what had seemed like a distant tragedy re-emerged with chilling clarity. For Los Angeles detectives, the investigation was no longer about chasing ghosts or dead ends. It was a race against time, and it centered on a man who'd slipped through the cracks of both cities' trust. Months of frustrating silence were shattered with every connection. Carpet fibers from the Bellingham crime scene, almost invisible to the naked eye, revealed themselves under a microscope to be the same distinctive blend found on bodies back in Los Angeles. A half-smudged bloodstain, transferred from an ordinary belt, so easily overlooked, carried enough DNA for investigators to tie the violence together with silent certainty. And there was more. The methodically sanitized bodies, the telltale signs of handcuffs or makeshift bindings. They spoke a language only detectives desperate for answers could understand. Meanwhile, police in LA, veterans whose faces were prematurely aged by the ghosts of those 10 young women, pored over their old paperwork, tape recordings, and scribbled notes. Each confirmation, each matching detail hit the squad room like a thunderclap. "It's him," someone whispered. But it wasn't that simple, and everyone knew it. The question was no longer only who, but how deeply this man's shadow had reached. Did he act alone? Was he a lone wolf, or just the visible face of a darker, shared conspiracy? As digging continued, a picture of Kenneth Bianchi's life in Los Angeles emerged, blurred but unmistakably sinister. He was neither the charming boy next door, nor a simple thug. Bianchi had an odd combination of authority and desperation. A failed drive for a police badge, a jumping trail of low-wage jobs, and a telltale fascination with uniforms and the power they projected. He had practiced what it might feel like to command and intimidate, spinning versions of himself, sometimes protector, sometimes predator. Police realized he likely learned police lingo, routines, and the look of the law itself. That knowledge had let him walk the thin line between safety and savagery, appearing as a guardian to his would-be victims until it was too late. Journalists, quick to pounce on every new turn, splattered headlines with questions. Was he one of their own? And, is Los Angeles nightmare tied to a face with a badge? For the public, the shock was profoundly destabilizing. People who'd slowly begun to relax after the murder spree now felt the salt poured anew into old wounds. The safety of daylight, the comfort of the police, the separateness of monsters, all of it suddenly warped. Radio hosts fielded anxious callers, and neighborhood watch groups swelled every night. In one West Side cafe, an old-timer muttered, "You never know what a person's hiding under their coat." It wasn't just the killer's actions, it was the betrayal by a man who'd studied how to appear harmless, even helpful. Behind the scenes, a feverish hunt for evidence consumed both police forces. Detectives spent countless nights reviewing old witness statements, re-interviewing waitresses from faded diners, bar owners, gas station attendants, anyone who might recall a shy young man with California plates. Psychological profilers weighed in, painting the portrait of a killer who thrived on organization, deception, and a sick kind of partnership. But with Kenneth in custody, the fear did not vanish. In quiet offices overflowing with case files, investigators, almost despite themselves, believed there could be more. Footprints rarely belonged to just one shadow, and Kenneth's habits hinted at an accomplice. The pattern was too elaborate, the risk-taking too brazen for one man to sustain alone. Cops in both states combed through associates, drawn again and again to the cruel figure of Angelo Buono, a relative whose name had surfaced in old phone records, whose cold charisma left a trace in Kenneth's stories. The Los Angeles investigation, now reignited, took on new urgency. Find the partners, uncover every hidden victim, and finally bring justice to those who had lived too long under the weight of unspoken grief. For the families, hope flickered uncertainly between dread and closure. For the city, the dawning truth felt as complicated as the original horror. Justice might come, but innocence would never fully return. That first clue in a northern college town had become a beacon, a jagged, painful light that at last began to draw out the full shape of the darkness that had haunted Los Angeles. The pursuit had shifted, no longer searching just for a monster but for the roots of a nightmare, and maybe, in the slow grind of human effort, a way to finally outrun it. Turning the tables on villains. With the clues slowly stacking up and the horrors refusing to fade from the city's collective memory, the relentless machinery of the investigation finally ground toward its ultimate reckoning. Lat Mat Aknan, the unmasking of the culprit, was by no means a single lightning strike moment. Instead, it was a slow, grinding, drawn-out revelation, as if the darkness itself had to be peeled away layer by painstaking layer. In the police headquarters, desks overflowed with files, tape recordings, and stacks of cryptic forensic diagrams. The evidence was tangible now. More than just rumors and shadows cast on the hillsides, there were carpet fibers, inconspicuous but insistent in their resemblance between scenes. Handwritten logs discovered in the belongings of a former security guard, Kenneth Bianchi, suggested patterns of movement eerily similar to those in Los Angeles's growing list of victims. DNA technology, still primitive by today's standards, became the cold arbiter confirming what many investigators had begun to suspect. The same hands had tied knots, had washed bodies, had left unspoken messages for those desperate enough to follow the trail, and that trail, against the odds, finally led them to Kenneth Bianchi. The contrast between his ordinary demeanor and the monstrous crimes was jarring. Those who had encountered him noted how easy it had been at first to accept him as just another man struggling to find his place after failing to become a real police officer. He slipped between towns, picking up odd jobs, always hovering on the periphery of law enforcement as if hungering for the legitimacy he could never quite claim. That craving for authority, combined with his uncanny knack for mimicry, had become the seed from which a monstrous partnership would bloom. It was the cooperation between police departments in two distant states, California and Washington, that allowed the clues to arrange themselves into a pattern sharp enough to cut through all doubt. Bianchi's move north, fleeing the heat of suspicion and the ghostly echo of his crimes, had inadvertently led him into a fresh investigation in Bellingham. There, the gruesome murder of two college women mirrored the brutality that haunted Los Angeles, down to the smallest forensic signature, the staged scene, the sanitized bodies, the barely there trace evidence. By now, every forensic specialist working the case was fighting exhaustion, but adrenaline surged anew as they matched carpet fibers and partial fingerprints between the two geographies. The emotional weight in the squad rooms was palpable. Some detectives who'd grown gray chasing shadows finally saw a clear line running through every dead end. The psychological profilers were vindicated. These crimes bore the hallmarks not just of a single man but a mind deeply invested in control, method, and possibly partnership. Rumors grew into certainty as Buock evidence emerged. Bianchi had not acted alone. And so the focus widened to the second face in the mirror, Angelo Buono, a man whose criminal record read like a study in intimidation and manipulation. Peeling back the layers of Kenneth's relationship with Angelo became an exercise in both police procedure and psychological warfare. Investigators sifted through months of phone records, interviews with neighbors and former acquaintances, and re-examined old witness statements under the sharper lens of hindsight. What they pieced together was chilling. Bianchi and Buono were more than relatives. Together they formed a predatory duo who fed off each other's darkness, drifting seamlessly between the roles of protector and predator. It was Buono's reputation in the Los Angeles underworld that both emboldened and shielded him. He operated an auto upholstery shop, a place frequented by runaways, the desperate, and the unnoticed. There was always the faintest whiff of menace in the air, something that hinted at unspeakable acts hidden behind closed doors. Looking back, some locals remembered seeing young women led inside, never to emerge. At the time, their absence barely registered in a city notorious for its constant turnover of faces and dreams. Now those recollections cast a new, terrifying light on old suspicions. The interrogation of Kenneth Bianchi unfolded not as a clean confession, but as a mental chess match. Detectives played tape after tape of testimony and revisited every scrap of evidence, watching for cracks in his story. They observed his shifting affect, the evasions and reflexive lies, the moments when he folded in on himself as the weight of what he had done finally threatened to suffocate him. Psychologists hired by both sides examined him, speculating about dissociation, split personalities, and the possibility of extreme manipulation at Buono's hands. Some even wondered if Bianchi, obsessive in his mimicry of law enforcement, was ultimately a follower, a man who'd seek out someone like Buono for the permission to become monstrous. But when pressed with the choice between the death penalty and a chance at life, Bianchi finally broke. He began to talk, first in halting admissions and then in a torrent of revelation that sent shockwaves through both police departments. He painted the picture of two men donning the trappings of authority, swapping badges and jargon, and weaponizing the city's trust. The revelations were gut-wrenching, evidence of premeditation, of rehearsals and practice runs, of a calculated hunt carried out in terrifying synchrony. Bianchi's confessions, backed by hard forensic evidence and physical artifacts found in both his and Buono's residences, took the case out of the realm of rumor and transformed it into a legal sledgehammer. The investigation widened, drawing in more witnesses, digging through back-alley deals and faded memories for even a sliver of corroboration. The city's newspapers seized every detail, and public horror combined with a grim fascination as the complete, awful truth emerged. The effects were immediate and profound. Mothers who'd clung tight to their daughters understood, finally, what darkness had stalked their neighborhoods. Police vowed never to let procedural cracks grow wide enough for monsters to pass unnoticed. And for those detectives whose careers and psyches had been battered by the case, there was the bittersweet satisfaction of closure, even as they took stock of the way evil had disguised itself in plain clothes and polite smiles. The legal reckoning would take years, with lawyers battering each other in marathon court sessions, and the city's collective trauma debated in public. But none of that could erase the indelible moment when the monsters behind the badge were finally, undeniably unmasked. Looking at Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Buono across the courtroom, city officials, grieving families, and even hardened detectives felt their blood run cold, knowing that sometimes evil is not a shadow on the hill but walks in broad daylight, wearing the face of a man you might trust to help you cross the street. Their unmasking changed Los Angeles forever. Gone was the notion that monsters hid only in the dark. The city learned painfully that sometimes horror wears a uniform and smiles like a neighbor. The unmasking at last brought a measure of justice, but never restored the innocence that had been so ruthlessly stolen. From protector to butcher. The transformation of Kenneth Bianchi from an eager would-be police officer to one of America's most reviled serial killers is a study in darkness concealed by the thinnest veil of normalcy. To understand this descent, one must step into the fractured mind of a man who once dreamed of safeguarding his community, only to become the architect of unimaginable horror. Kenneth's early life painted him as a restless drifter, with grand ambitions and a desperate craving for acceptance. Growing up, he had fixated on the notion of respectability and power, traits he associated most closely with the men in uniform patrolling city streets. Setting his sights on law enforcement, Kenneth poured his efforts into acquiring the discipline and comportment of an officer, yet every application to police academies and security firms ended in failure. Rejection, for Kenneth, was not simply a setback, but a wound that began to fester, eroding his already fragile sense of self-worth. He found, eventually, a kind of solace in the fringes of authority, securing low-level security guard positions. The navy blue uniforms fit well enough, but the reality never compared to the image he'd long cherished. Bianchi became obsessed with the transformative power of the badge, a simple piece of metal that could instantly shift the dynamic in any situation. To him, it was more than a symbol of protection, it was a ticket to control, to validation, and, as the world was soon to discover, domination. It was around this period of bitterness and dashed dreams that Kenneth's path fatefully crossed with his older cousin, Angelo Buono. If Kenneth was a lost soul yearning to belong, Angelo was already steeped in a lifetime of manipulation and violence. Operating on the fringes of Los Angeles's criminal underworld, Buono wielded his own brand of authority, one built not on law, but on fear, intimidation, and a remorseless willingness to exploit the desperate. Angelo's presence was intoxicating for Kenneth, both terrifying and alluring. When the two came together, a twisted mentor-apprentice dynamic soon emerged. It was as if Kenneth discovered in his cousin the darker version of the brotherhood he had always longed for. Under Angelo's influence, Kenneth's impulses shifted rapidly from fantasy into action. The initial thrill of donning a badge, even a counterfeit one, transmuted quickly into a weapon. Together, they would patrol the neon-lit boulevards and shadow-soaked side streets, masquerading as protectors while seeking out the vulnerable to satisfy their own predatory appetites. The pair moved with chilling coordination. Bianchi, who had practiced police jargon and studied the rituals of law enforcement, took the lead in approaching women, his fake badge gleaming in the streetlights. Buono shadowed him, ever the silent enforcer, exuding threat without a word. They exploited the inherent trust placed in uniforms, using their faux authority to lure victims out of crowded public spaces and into the shadows where help was beyond reach. Inside the makeshift interrogation rooms of Buono's auto upholstery shop, Kenneth's entire demeanor transformed. Where he had once aspired to reassure and serve, he now choreographed horrifying scenes of domination and cruelty. The tools of law and order, handcuffs, nylon ligatures, tape, became instruments of terror, turned by Kenneth and Angelo into symbols of twisted power. Kenneth was meticulous. He mimicked the cadence of official questioning, searched for imagined contraband, all the while knowing his performance would end in violence. But Bianchi's descent wasn't confined only to the moments of physical violence. There was a psychological unraveling as well. Each successful crime hardened him, blurring the boundaries between roleplay and reality. No longer just an imposter, Kenneth began to believe in his own monstrous authority. The sense of immunity intoxicated him, as did the knowledge that the city, with all its resources and vigilance, remained blind to his true identity. Behind closed doors, Kenneth and Angelo would review the headlines about the Hillside Strangler with a mix of glee and disdain, convinced of their own invincibility. For Kenneth, every night that passed without detection was further proof that he'd ascended to a kind of outlaw officer, above the law and answerable only to his darkest compulsions. This psychological shift was perhaps the final, most damning stage of his transformation. What makes Kenneth's journey from would-be hero to calculated butcher even more chilling is how ordinary he seemed to the outside world. Neighbors described him as friendly if a bit aloof. At his job, he was just another security guard, a face among many overseeing empty parking lots and darkened corridors. Those who knew him best often brushed aside his odd hours or his occasional flashes of bravado. No one could have imagined what those nights concealed. There were moments, fleeting, almost accidental, when the facade would crack. Kenneth's mother noticed a hardening in his eyes and an edge to his voice. Old friends felt his bottomless need for approval become somehow more desperate, more suffocating. His romantic relationships faltered under the strain of secrets he dared not reveal. Yet rather than breaking, Kenneth accelerated further into the abyss, fueled by the dual fires of Angelo's approval and the thrill of having finally attained a twisted, contaminated kind of power. In a bitterly ironic sense, Kenneth Bianchi did achieve the authority and notoriety he had always craved, but only by embracing everything he had once claimed to abhor. He became not the guardian of the hills, but their shadow, an echo of what happens when the urge to protect warps into the lust to dominate. The road from protector to butcher was less a series of conscious choices than a miserable slide down a slope greased by rejection, envy, and sinister companionship. Kennedy's legacy is a dark warning. Sometimes the uniforms of trust can be donned by the very men from whom we most need protection. The dark night before the dawn of justice. As night draped itself over Los Angeles and the investigation reached its boiling point, the city's heart beat in uneasy sync with the drama unfolding behind police station walls and courtroom doors. This was not the triumphant climax of a detective novel, it was a long, shivering night of uncertainty, where every ray of hope seemed fragile and faint. Kenneth Bianchi, now in custody, transformed the police process into a nightmarish maze. At first he clung desperately to a web of lies. He feigned illnesses, cycled through erratic bouts of cooperation and obstinate silence, and even attempted to convince doctors and investigators that he suffered from multiple personalities. In the sterile, flickering light of the police interrogation rooms, Bianchi's behavior swung wildly between cunning calculation and apparent breakdown. To the detectives who watched him, it was like observing an animal that alternated between playing dead and baring its fangs, never letting them near his core. The pressure was immense, not only on law enforcement but on the broader community as well. Newspapers ran stories framed by bold headlines, splashing Bianchi's face across the morning coffee tables of millions of anxious California residents. Talk radio stations buzzed with speculation. Would the man caught in Washington be the answer to Los Angeles's darkest riddle? Families of victims clung to their phones, waiting for news, any news, that might bring a thread of closure, while attorneys and detectives fought exhaustion and the gnawing fear that something or someone might still slip through their grasp. Negotiations in the justice system now became as tangled and tense as the man they had captured. At first, Bianchi's defense mounted a sophisticated campaign: psychiatric evaluations, expert testimonies, and a barrage of psychological assessments that conjured diagnostic terms like dissociative identity disorder into public discourse. Detective squads sat through mind-numbing hours of legal wrangling, all the while worried that a clever enough lawyer could wriggle Bianchi through some loophole, drowning the truth in a tide of jargon. But challenges ran even deeper. The weight of the case bore down on prosecutors, who feared that one misstep might result in the man going free or escaping death row on a technicality. The country's spotlight fixed intensely on every move. Any perceived injustice, any flaw in the process might not only prevent closure for the victims' families, but would also further erode public faith in the courts. In the minds of many, justice itself seemed endangered, precariously hinging on the guilty confession of a manipulative and cunning killer. Within the echoing confines of the prison, Bianchi's own psychological war intensified. He became a master manipulator, giving fragments of confession, only to retreat into silence or carefully crafted outrage. His moods could turn from chilling casualness to sudden theatrical outburst. Law enforcement wrestled with his refusal to break fully. The city waited, tense and tired, as if holding a collective breath before what everyone hoped would be the dawn. It was ultimately Bianchi's yearning for self-preservation that broke the impasse. Faced by the mounting evidence, the cold persistence of experienced detectives, and the looming specter of the death penalty, he began to bargain. What started as mere hints and half-truths gradually became more substantial. Mentions of his cousin Angelo Buono, details only a perpetrator would know, and finally, the admission of his role as one half of the city's most feared duo. Night after night, tired prosecutors and police officers sat through interviews in fluorescent-lit rooms, watching the man who had once terrorized Los Angeles now scramble to save himself by turning informer. Each revelation was a wound reopening, sickening but necessary. The truth spilled out in fragments: the impersonation of law enforcement, the cold selection of victims, the clinical methods deployed to erase forensic evidence. For detectives, it was a chilling experience. They realized now just how calculated and premeditated the acts had been, and how closely Bianchi and Buono had studied the vulnerable psyche of an entire city. There was rage, yes, but also a fathomless sorrow as names and faces became stories, and stories became evidence. As the scope of Bianchi's cooperation came into focus, so did a network of secrets. His interviews confirmed and clarified details that law enforcement had struggled for months, sometimes years, to piece together. He detailed the tools of deception, the way the pair crafted false badges and orchestrated scripted traffic stops as a prelude to their crimes. He offered chilling play-by-plays of victim abductions, how trust was weaponized, kindness mimicked, and hope extinguished behind closed doors. Each confession was a thread in a tapestry of horror. Yet even as Bianchi unraveled, the shadow of Buono loomed larger. Authorities in both states now scrambled to gather and corroborate every shred of evidence, tapping phone lines, digging into old storage lockers, re-interviewing witnesses who had long lost hope in justice. Families who'd lived with the ache of loss for years were pulled back into the process. There was gratitude perhaps that an answer was at last within reach, but it was a gratitude tinged with fresh agony, a painful remembering of those long months of dread in Los Angeles's hills and backstreets. This period before the trial, this dark, restless night before the dawn of justice, was a strange liminal space. Reporters camped on courthouse steps. Neighborhoods formed tight circles of gossip and memory. Police officers doubled back over old case files, haunted by what they'd missed. Even after Bianchi's partial break, there was fear that he might recant, or that legal technicalities could shield Buono from consequences. And in this gray space, the city of Los Angeles learned a terrible lesson about patience and perseverance. The drive for justice meant withstanding not only the monstrous crimes themselves, but also the agony of incomplete answers and a system buckling under its own complexity. Justice, it turned out, was not a single moment of triumph, but a gradual illumination, the unpeeling of lies, the acceptance of hard truths, and trust in imperfect human resolve. When dawn finally crept in, promising something like closure, it did not feel like victory, just a kind of exhausted relief for a city that had spent too many nights in terror, waiting for someone to finally name the monsters in its midst. Conspiracy in prison. After the notorious arrests and sensational trials, most would assume that terror born from the Hillside Strangler case would quietly die behind prison walls. Yet, even confined by steel bars and unending surveillance, Kenneth Bianchi managed to wage psychological warfare far beyond his cell. What unfolded was a tangled, almost unbelievable plot. His attempt to manufacture new evidence and create the illusion of another copycat killer on the outside, in a desperate gambit to muddy his own guilt, and perhaps win a pathway out of the death penalty. Bianchi's prison machinations began with calculated subtlety. Isolated physically but never intellectually idle, Kenneth realized both the authorities and media still hung on to every twist in his story. His reputation as a manipulator had only grown since his arrest. He was a man who had played at multiple personalities in court, and now he looked to play everyone else as well. The dark seed of his next plan found its soil in a most unexpected place: the letters exchanged with Veronica Compton, an aspiring actress and playwright with a fascination for infamy and damaged men. Their correspondence, initially filtered through prison censors intrigued by the odd match, soon deepened into a gothic partnership fueled by delusion and mutual exploitation. Veronica, by turns infatuated with Kenneth and absorbed in her own fantasies of criminal folklore, was the perfect partner in Bianchi's eyes. She admired his intelligence and suffering genius persona and grew obsessed with the hope that she could both aid and redeem him. Before long their letters were filled not with professions of love but with conspiratorial talk of staged evidence and helping. Both Kenneth and the story itself transcend the banal fate carved for them by the courts. It was a plot that would make even hard-boiled detectives shake their heads. Bianchi convinced Compton that if she could commit a murder mimicking the Strangler's methods, it might throw enough confusion into the legal proceedings to sow reasonable doubt. If such a crime appeared while Kenneth was incarcerated, surely someone else must be at large. Behind bars, Bianchi's manipulation reached new heights. He coached Veronica in staggering detail: which ligatures to use, how to stage the victim, the type of writing to leave, even how to transfer his own DNA, a sample of his semen clandestinely shipped in a letter, onto the crime scene. She eagerly soaked up every instruction, believing the act would not only help her save Kenneth, but also finally grant her a notorious kind of stardom by association. In the free world, Veronica struggled between infatuation and insecurity, her days a blur of rehearsed alibis and desperate planning. Her efforts were almost theatrical. She stalked bars in the Pacific Northwest, watching women who fit the Strangler's victim profile, but her amateurism proved her undoing. When she attempted to strangle a woman in a Washington hotel, the victim successfully fought back, raising the alarm and escaping with her life. Though shaken, the authorities quickly pieced together the bizarre connection. The would-be killer was not just a misguided admirer, but a conspirator coached by Bianchi himself. Evidence, notes, DNA samples, and the surging correspondence led straight back through postmarks and prison logs to Cell Block A. The revelation sent shockwaves through the legal community and the broader public. For Los Angeles authorities, already exhausted by years of horror, it was like watching a nightmare drag its wounded leg back onto center stage. For prosecutors, the incident reaffirmed what they'd always feared. Bianchi was not only remorseless but pitilessly clever, his appetite for manipulation unquenched by concrete and razor wire. The plot's exposure allowed them to quash any glimmer of reasonable doubt in his original crimes. Even in chains, Kenneth Bianchi sought to control the narrative, to bend reality one more time in his favor. Veronica Compton's trial would play out like a twisted sideshow to the original Strangler cases, its absurdities tinged with the tragic earnestness of a lost soul wandering through someone else's wicked myth. On the stand, she veered between professing undying loyalty to Bianchi and confessing to being swept up into an emotional maelstrom she could hardly comprehend. Psychiatry experts debated whether she was herself a pawn or an equal architect of the plot, highlighting anew the complex currents of obsession, loneliness, and psychological control that ripple through infamous crimes. Her failed attack and subsequent conviction deflated whatever credibility Bianchi had hoped to preserve in his own appeals. In the process, an even wider circle of manipulation came to light as interview records revealed Bianchi had floated similar ideas to various pen pals and visitors. Every new document, secretly recorded jail call, and defeated letter reinforced the portrait of a man for whom deceit was both survival strategy and compulsion. The fiasco closed off any avenue for his exoneration or parole, solidifying his image as a remorseless architect of suffering who would use anyone and any weakness for his own ends. In the aftermath, the Veronica Compton episode cast a lasting shadow over the way American prisons and legal systems handled notorious inmates. Security around correspondence for high-profile criminals was tightened dramatically. Psychological screening was expanded for those drawn to criminals in hybristophiliac relationships. Investigators revisited cold cases across the West, checking for signs of distant hands acting on behalf of imprisoned monsters. And for Los Angeles, this bizarre prison plot was one last cruel lesson. Evil did not always die quietly behind bars. Instead, it could adapt, replicate, and find new accomplices in the most unexpected of places. The city's resolve hardened, a commitment to vigilance not just in catching monsters but in ensuring they could never again spin their webs from within the supposed safety of their cells. For the public, Veronica's story became a cautionary tale, how the thirst for infamy, love, or purpose can be twisted by proximity to true darkness. For Bianchi, it was the final nail, exposed as not only a killer, but an inescapable manipulator whose reach could not be trusted even through solid steel. And as the world turned its attention to the next headline, the marks left by his prison plots lingered as an indelible part of the Hillside Strangler legacy, reminding everyone that some nightmares echo long after the cell door slams shut. Overwhelming final stage. The courtroom was no longer just a stage for the legal system. It became a crucible in which the most chilling truths of the Hillside Strangler saga were melted down, examined, and set in the stone of public memory. The trial of Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Buono stretched on for over 2 years, making headlines not just in Los Angeles, but across the entire nation. From the moment the prosecution assembled its mountainous file of evidence, it was clear that this would be no ordinary case. This was a reckoning for the city and the country, a rare glimpse at the monstrous workings of two men who changed the shape of fear itself. From the outside, the proceedings had an almost theatrical quality. Lines of reporters snaked through the courthouse doors each dawn, local TV stations ran hourly updates, and every development filtered through a public aching for justice, closure, and maybe even catharsis. But for the families of the victims, every day in court was a reopening of wounds, photographs of lost daughters, harrowing testimony, and the raw recitation of crimes that read like something torn from a nightmare. To testify meant to relive those last phone calls, the unreturned letters, the empty beds at home. Mothers and fathers sat shoulder to shoulder sharing Kleenex and prayers, bound by grief that became a kind of hollow solidarity. Inside the courtroom, the gravity of the accusations found sharp focus. The prosecution painstakingly walked through the physical evidence, carpet fibers that tied bodies to Buono's shop, handcuffs and nylon cord that mirrored marks on the victims, and diaries smudged with chilling details only a perpetrator could have known. Forensic experts traced the science behind every clue, while detectives recounted month after month of sleepless investigation, a true-life patchwork of patrol logs, phone records, and fragments of survivors' memories. It was relentless and exhausting, as if every day pressed down on the shoulders of all those present. Defense attorneys, however, were determined to exploit every shadow of doubt. Bianchi's earlier claims of dissociative identity disorder were cross-examined by a parade of psychiatrists and psychologists. Buono, for his part, maintained cold innocence, sometimes impassive, sometimes sneering, as his legal team tried to sever the chilling partnership, positioning him as a victim of Bianchi's manipulative, unstable psyche. The battle of expert witnesses became fierce, a psychological chess game played out under the Klieg lights of the law, where every contradiction was a lifeline for the defense. Yet it was the sheer, overwhelming pattern of evidence that proved unbreakable. Jurors, some weeping, others stunned into silence, sat through weeks of survivor testimony and graphic forensic detail. The trial revealed not just the brutality of the crimes but also the careful choreography behind them, how Bianchi and Buono wielded fake badges with convincing authority, lured women from city sidewalks, transported them through winding hills, and left behind a trail of heartbreak masked beneath calculated erasure of clues. The courtroom air often felt close and heavy. Some days counselors were called in simply to help the court staff process what they had heard. Media coverage fanned the flames of public outrage with front-page headlines cataloging each new revelation. The city felt as if it were holding its breath. No one seemed capable of focusing on anything but the trial's next dramatic turn. Coffee shops, barber chairs, and factory floors all echoed with speculation about which man was more culpable, whether there might be other victims, and how it was possible that a city full of dreamers could also nurture monsters of such cold calculation. Outside the court, demonstrations flared. Advocacy groups protested the way the system had failed vulnerable women. Others demanded the harshest possible penalty, brandishing posters with the faces of the murdered. As testimony revealed the chilling process by which trust in authority was weaponized, civic debate spilled into the open. How could two men masquerading as protectors have so thoroughly deceived the community? Was there enough oversight on those who wore a badge, or claimed to? The defense was relentless in challenging evidence, and at times appeared poised to stir up reasonable doubt. But as the trial pushed deeper, it became clear that Kenneth Bianchi's own words would be the key. His confession, volatile and self-serving as it was, laid bare the methodical brutality and the shared guilt. His eventual cooperation with the prosecution, in exchange for a life sentence rather than death, sealed much of the case against Buono, even as it infuriated some of the bereaved. There was no room now for doubt. Both men had been architects of calculated horror. As the verdicts approached, tension inside and outside the courthouse rose to a fever pitch. The final days of testimony became a grim procession. Mothers describing photo albums with missing pages, investigators outlining the sick precision of the crimes, friends recalling laughter that would never return. When the jury retired to deliberate, the city seemed to freeze. News helicopters hovered, and live broadcasts lingered on the courthouse steps, capturing every shadow that flickered across the faces of families and legal teams. The outcome, though widely anticipated, did not come with celebrations, but with a communal exhale. Angelo Buono was handed 9 consecutive life sentences, one for each murder proven conclusively beyond all doubt. The judge's words echoed through the court. "You are among the most evil individuals ever brought before this bench." The sentence was not simply about justice for the dead, but a warning to anyone who would dare to exploit trust for monstrous ends. Kenneth Bianchi, for his part, was sentenced to multiple life terms as well. There would be no possibility of parole for either man. Neither displayed remorse as the sentences were read. Buono's face remained an inscrutable mask, while Bianchi's posture suggested the fading bravado of a defeated manipulator. The city at last glimpsed the true faces of the predators who had stalked its streets, and though they had been removed from society, the wounds their crimes opened would linger for generations. The legal aftermath stretched on as both convicts launched appeals and, in Bianchi's case, attempted further manipulations from behind bars. Yet, thanks to the relentless efforts of detectives, prosecutors, and the resilience of victim families, none of these gambits gained real traction. Over time, the story of the Hillside Stranglers would become woven into the fabric of Los Angeles's identity, a scar, but also a testament to stubborn human strength in the face of the absolute worst. The impact of the trial echoed far beyond the court's marble halls. Police procedures for vetting and tracking authority figures became stricter. Public awareness campaigns flourished, teaching young people to question and verify instead of simply trusting a badge or uniform. The court's findings were studied in law schools and criminal justice departments across the country. For years after, defense attorneys and prosecutors alike sharpened their craft on the subtleties and setbacks of this legendary case. There was no true catharsis for those who had lost the most, but there was clarity. Evil, even when cloaked in the guise of protection, could be recognized, pursued, and ultimately caged. Yet Los Angeles emerged from the ordeal changed. A city that once embraced its nighttime glamour with an easy confidence had learned the hard way that glamour can cast shadows, and shadows sometimes pulse with danger. Boulevards that had once been promising avenues for starlets and dreamers now carried the memory of night rides that ended in tragedy. In the weeks that followed the sentencing, civil organizations and grassroots groups rallied to support surviving family members and re-examine how law enforcement handled missing persons cases. It was as if the city, chastened but not broken, resolved not to let such horror slip unseen through its streets again. Counseling services expanded. Nonprofits handed out leaflets with self-defense advice and lists of emergency contacts. Community meetings, once sparsely attended, swelled with concerned parents, promising never again to let fear isolate their daughters or numb their neighborhoods to a stranger's distress. For 2 years the trial had been a dark mirror, reflecting not just the evil of two men, but the vulnerabilities of a city that wanted so badly to believe in its own innocence. The final verdict was not only a judgment on the accused, but a communal reckoning, a promise that even in the aftermath of horror, decency and determination would have the last word. The Hillside Strangler case forever changed how Los Angeles viewed itself. The nightmare did not dissolve entirely with the clang of the cell door, but the city chose not to look away, insisting instead on learning, remembering, and forging a path forward where monsters would find it much harder to hide. The legacy of darkness. The shadow of the Hillside Stranglers, Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Buono, did not fade with the clang of the cell door or the gavel's final strike. Instead, it imprinted itself on Los Angeles and the wider American psyche in ways few crimes ever have. The case reshaped not just the way authorities hunt serial predators, but also how a city and a nation reckon with fear, trust, and their own capacity for denial. Los Angeles, once a sun-drenched symbol of American optimism, found itself transformed in the years that followed the convictions. Gone was the innocent faith in the glitzy promise of California's hills and the supposed safety of its suburban enclaves. For months, and then years, residents marked dusk with wariness rather than anticipation. The city's geography, once bathed in Hollywood myth, seemed altered for good. Romance drained from canyons and hillsides, replaced by memories of headlines and candlelight vigils. The freedom of late-night strolls, the thrill of a city that never slept, became tinged with a wariness that no amount of sunshine could dispel. Yet the legacy does not rest only in fear. Out of the darkness emerged an urgent, ongoing re-evaluation of public trust, especially in authority figures and systems that had failed so tragically. Police procedures changed. Los Angeles reformed protocols on verifying officers' identities, ensuring plainclothes units were distinguishable, their activities logged and overseen. Regular police trainings challenged officers to recognize warning signs not just among the public, but within their own ranks. The investigation's initial failures, allowing Bianchi and Buono to masquerade as lawmen, became cautionary tales in academies across the United States. National conferences on law enforcement spent years dissecting trust-based predation, spiraling from the patterns of the Stranglers to broader questions around the checks and balances placed on police power. For advocates and grassroots organizers, the case was both a rallying cry and a wound. Women's rights groups and community activists seized the moment, pushing for broader support networks and systemic change. Self-defense seminars, neighborhood watch programs, and crisis hotlines multiplied across Southern California. Teachers incorporated lessons on personal safety and skepticism into public school curriculums. Flyers went up in laundromats and diners, warning young women to trust their instincts, verify credentials, and stick to main roads and well-lit spaces. The families of the victims, meanwhile, became public symbols of resilience and reluctant educators for future generations. Many mothers and siblings spoke at town halls or before lawmakers, lending their voices to the push for smarter policing and more transparent missing persons protocols. Working with survivor networks, they advocated for reforms that would require law enforcement to take disappearance reports seriously from the outset, especially when patterns began to emerge. The notion that a string of tragedies could be labeled runaways was no longer tolerated in policy or public opinion, an evolution forced by the raw ache of the Stranglers' killing spree. Legally, the impact stretched well beyond the borders of California. Prosecutors and defense attorneys across the nation studied the Strangler trials as templates for handling high-profile serial killer cases, forensic evidence strategy, and the navigation of insanity defenses. Forensic pathology, then a burgeoning field, underwent a boom. Police labs invested in new technologies for DNA analysis, carpet fiber matching, and the management of massive evidence case files. The clear linkages between distant crime scenes, thanks in part to the cross-state connection between Los Angeles and Bellingham, pushed for tighter national collaboration between law enforcement agencies. Federal databases would eventually be established, inspired partly by the information vacuum that allowed Bianchi and Buono to escape suspicion for so long. The media, too, was forever changed. The Strangler case revealed both the dangers and the necessities of intense press coverage. Reporters' zeal for exclusives led at times to panic and rumor-mongering, but their investigations also unearthed connections and societal blind spots that helped pressure official action. Over time, journalists became more attuned to issues of victim blaming, the intricacies of trauma reporting, and the importance of language that honored victims' humanity rather than sensationalizing their suffering. Culturally, the echo endured in film, literature, and art, inspiring a flood of crime novels, screenplays, documentaries, and even music. Yet if early retellings sometimes indulged in lurid detail, later generations of storytellers probed the deeper questions raised by the case. What does evil look like when bearing a friendly face? How do communities recover their sense of safety or rebuild trust when the very symbols of protection are turned against them? The Hillside Strangler entered the American lexicon as a bitter shorthand for hidden horrors and broken trust. For some, the legacy was intensely personal. Thousands of Angelenos, especially women, carried the experience into adulthood, their decisions forever shaped by the shadow of the stranglers. Daughters told and retold parental warnings. Couples redefined how and where they met. Law enforcement officers spoke of the case as a formative scar, one that instilled humility and vigilance but also a sense of mission to prevent any recurrences. Social workers and therapists built careers on helping survivors of violence navigate a world that for a time seemed both smaller and infinitely more dangerous. But perhaps the deepest legacy lies in the delicate, ongoing effort to balance vigilance with hope. Los Angeles, bruised but not broken, eventually reclaimed its streets, reinventing them with public memorials, anti-violence marches, and continuing education for both youth and authorities. Each anniversary of the case prompts not just remembrance but public dialogue about community strength, trauma, and the work of healing. Designers of urban spaces pushed for better lighting and safer pedestrian routes, not just in response to the Stranglers, but as a declaration of resistance to the darkness that tried to claim the city's soul. The case continues to resonate as a warning and a challenge. Monsters can indeed walk in daylight, sometimes carrying a badge or a neighbor's smile, but the resolve of a community to confront, learn, and adapt endures longer than any nightmare. The lessons and scars of the Hillside Strangler years remain, etched into policy, memory, and the city's landscape, a constant reminder that true safety comes not from denial, but from courage, vigilance, and a shared commitment to never looking away when the shadows begin to lengthen.